is what they are offering companies. Now, a Dáil question was addressed to Minister Noonan by Seamus Healy. And Seamus wanted to know the numbers that were working in construction. Now, the number of employments in construction in 2008, 150,000. By 2010, that had halved, almost halved, to 77,000. These are nothing, the rise in self-employment is nothing more than tax evasion smokescreens. That's all it is. Now, in the UK, they are fighting payroll companies. They are taking on these agreements that exist. And they're saying, no, you are not self-employed. You are employees. In Ireland, in 1988, the PAC investigated 60,000 workers in the construction industry. They found 1 in 5 to be self-employed. 2 years later, the Comptroller and Auditor General wasn't satisfied that that had solved the problem and repeated the exercise and found 1 in 5 misclassified as self-employed. Now, in 2009, Revenue altogether investigated 48 cases. Social Welfare Appeals Office saw 102 appeals. Now, not all of them were employer-employee appeals. In the same year, in 2009, the RCT net take, was minus 53.9 million. Minus. How can tax take from workers be a minus figure? It was set up to take tax, and it's losing tax. Now, if there had not been a recession, we wouldn't know these figures. It's only because construction stopped that we were able to see how much the construction industry is being subsidised by the ERCT system. If you jump to 2014, Revenue did 191 investigations, and the Social Welfare Appeals Office saw 2 appeals of scope decisions. The worst losses on year for construction were also the worst year for construction, 1998. Everything stopped. 2008. Everything stopped. And that year, the loss was minus 67.3 million. Now, it's gone into the plus side again. 2014, we're up to 27.6. But this is masking losses of 67.3 million and more, because there are far more people now working under the ERCT system. In the early 90s, this is a bit of a history lesson, the Revenue Commissioners engaged with a number of employers over their non-compliance with their tax and PRSI obligations. At the time, many workers in industries were paid cash in hand, also known as the lump or the black economy. Although there was always a legal obligation on employers to make a return on any person who was paid more than 3,000 points, these non-compliant companies argued that their compliance was put on hold until the employment status of workers for tax and PRSI purposes was concluded. Despite dismissing this put on hold fallacy, Revenue absolved these companies of all past non-compliance and engaged in protracted discussions with the same non-compliant companies with a view to establishing a PAYE system for self-employed workers in these traditionally non-compliant industries. The operation of an industry-wide taxation at source systems are entirely dependent on blanket self-employment classification of all workers in these industries. Back in the 1990s, one of these other industry mechanisms, these PAYE mechanisms for self-employed people, came before the scope section for adjudication. In this instance, revenue and employers had agreed a system of tax collection based on the premise that all workers in that particular occupation were self-employed. Scope got wind of this and said, no, you can't do that. Scope took a worker and adjudicated that the worker was an employee and not self-employed, despite the agreement between employers and revenue. This decision was appealed to the appeals officer by the employee and the employer. They were happy. You know, the two of them were happy with the situation. But as I said earlier, it doesn't matter what you want. It's never a matter of choice. It's a matter of circumstance. The appeals office upheld the scope decision. This case was further appealed to the higher courts by the company and became the Irish Supreme Court case of Henry Denny and Sons Limited. Now, it was a scope decision that was upheld by the Social Welfare Appeals Office, that survived the High Court, and that survived the Supreme Court. It went all the way, which is what you would expect from scope. They are the experts. The Denny case is the fundamental test as to whether a person who has been engaged to perform certain tasks, certain work, performs it as a person in business on their own account. No blanket self-employment decisions. You can't do it. Denny was a change in status for revenue. They could no longer make these agreements based on one employee. 2 years later, I came along. I knew nothing about what had gone before. I was the test case dummy. For years, I questioned my employer's blanket classification of all workers in that industry as self-employed. And it wasn't just my employer. Almost every employer in the multi-million euro industry did the same. Revenue wouldn't tell me why. Initially, social welfare refused to engage and told me it was a revenue matter. It was only by chance that I discovered the scope section, and I rang them and asked, could I make a formal request for an insurability of employment? And they said yes. So I wrote to them. I also wrote to Jim Mitchell, was the chairperson at the time. I had one question for Jim. Why was he investigating the construction industry, which was reasonably well regulated, and not under other unregulated industries where there was ample evidence to indicate that employees were misclassified as self-employed? The PAC chairman, unlike today, was quick to act. Letters were sent to revenue commissioners, the HSA, and the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. The chairman of the revenue commissioners replied to Jim Mitchell soon after. I am directed by the chairman to refer to your letter of 25th of July concerning Mr. McMahon, motorcycle courier. Mr. McMahon's main concern seems to be health and safety in the courier business, and it was. As regard taxation, the issue of couriers, and particularly motorcycle couriers, was the subject of protracted discussions between revenue representatives and representatives of the courier industry. Not workers, courier company representatives. I enclosed copies of our letters 7th March 1997 and 3rd of April 1998 to accountants, which represented courier firms at the discussions. This letter outlines the agreement reached for tax purpose. Now this was, 7-8 page agreement to make couriers pay PAYE, work PAYE, and yet be classified as self-employed. It's euphemistically known as a local agreement. It was not the first agreement. Indeed, the Denny case is also the example of agreement. It couldn't be held as an indicator of self-employment. Now, the courier industry in Ireland started out in the early 80s Over a decade, it grew into a multi-million euro industry. Courier companies paid couriers on the lump. No taxes, no pre-RSI deducted, cash in hand, no questions asked. In 1997, following years of discussion, where courier companies point blank refused to declare payments in excess of £3,000 to their couriers, Revenue met with the courier company representatives in the Burlington Hotel, and this secret tax deal was agreed. This deal was so secret that scope deciding officers knew nothing about its existence 3 years later. And these are the guys who decide. Scope decide. The Revenue Chairman's letter went on to say, for the purpose of insurability under social welfare law, a motorcycle courier was found to be self-employed by the Social Community and Family Affairs Tribunal some years ago. This decision was not challenged further through the High Court on a point of law and consequently would stand for social insurance purposes. Now, what does it mean by the Social Community and Family Affairs Appeals Tribunal? What he means is the Social Welfare Appeals Office. And what the Social Welfare Appeals Office is the Kangaroo Court. Revenue are saying this case of a single courier decided all future cases. But each case is assessed on its own merit. The Social Welfare Appeals Office can't change that legal precedent. And there is no more legal justification for deciding all couriers are self-employed based on a single case than there is in deciding all doctors, all solicitors, or all journalists are self-employed based on a single case. The Social Welfare Appeals Office is a quasi-judicial body, an administrative body which exercises powers and functions similar to a judge, and not just any judge, similar to a circuit court judge. Despite its role as adjudicator over disputed decisions of the department, the Appeals Office is not an independent statutory body. It is an office of the Department of Social Protection, exactly the same as Scope is an office of the Department of Social Protection. And appeals officers are employees of that department. The Appeals Office is insufficiently independent from the Department of Social Protection, as it is staffed by civil servants from the same department who are in turn appointed without any transparent recruitment process. And that's from Flack.